Well, stimulus is one of the few weapons that the Fed has at its disposal to try to power U.S. growth. But Europe's debt burden is another story. It's high time for the world's brightest economic minds to thrash out some possible solutions. And that's what 19 Nobel laureates are doing. Now, they're gathered in Lindau, Germany, and our economics editor, David Tweed, is with them. David, what's exactly on the table there?
Well, there's going to be a lot of discussions here, Francine, of all sorts of issues facing economics and also the world economy at the moment. And to speak about that, I have Professor Edmund Phelps, who won the prize, the Nobel Prize in 2006. Right now, he's the director of the Center on Capitalism and Society at Columbia University. Professor Phelps, Jim O'Neill from Goldman Sachs Asset Management just the other day, he said that he considers that the biggest economic dilemma facing the Western world, or the world at the moment, is the European debt crisis. And I'm wondering whether you actually agree with that assessment.
Oh, I think I have a horse that can beat that.
Which is
the U.S. fiscal situation is dire. There have been estimates that public debt plus entitlements, which are the larger component, add up to $66 trillion. So we're going to need a war. We're going to have to be almost on a war footing to raise the tax revenues and prune the budget here and there in order to service that debt and meet those entitlements.
Well, what does that mean then? Are we looking at something like a Japanese period of extremely slow, sluggish growth while this debt problem, this debt mountain is dealt with?
Well, maybe if we left that problem unattended, we could run into some Japanese-type stagnation. But I would hope that we could do some things to goose up the dynamism of the American economy. It's fallen quite low in recent years. That's part of the problem. The politicians were expecting that they could grow out of the public debt, they could grow out of the entitlements, they could grow out of anything that they want to entertain. But we've had much slower growth since the mid-1970s than we had in earlier periods.
And of course, just last month, well, this month, we've had that downgrade by the Fed of its assessment of the U.S. economy. Right now, you talk about goosing up growth in the U.S. economy. We've got the meeting at Jackson's Hole coming up on Friday. We're going to hear a speech from Fed Chairman Mr. Bernanke. He's going to tell us about what the Fed might be able to do. What do you think are the options for the Fed in terms of goosing up the economy?
Well, I was a supporter of QE2 because I thought it was that the inflation rate was low and falling. It was urgent to do something about that. With a mix of good luck plus QE2, we did get the inflation rate back to 2%. So I don't think there's a strong case now for a QE3.
So you think
I don't think the Fed can do anything to goose up growth. I think we have to do structural things like a bank for innovation, for example. And also we could do something about high unemployment at the low end of the labor market, like wage subsidies to employers.
So these are policy decisions that should actually be faced by President Obama rather than by looking at the Fed to actually carry the burden.
Absolutely.
And let me just ask you, I do want to go back just on the Fed. You don't think that there should be any quantitative easing 3, right, so that those traders who are looking, if you look at bond yields, traders are actually pricing in that at the moment, then you'd be expecting to see the markets disappointed and probably a drop in treasuries as a result.
It almost sounds like blackmail. If the Fed doesn't do what we expect you to do, we're going to drop bond prices on you. But I think that's what will happen. Let
me switch the conversation back to Europe because obviously the European debt problem is a big issue here. Yeah. Now, Mohamed El-Arian from PIMCO was talking about the future of the euro and just said that, he really doesn't see that the euro as it is going to be able to continue with as many countries in the euro and actually sees the size of the euro shrinking. Would you agree with that?
Well, I can understand that's a strong possibility. Greece might have to pull out or be pushed out. That might be true of one or two other countries in the Mediterranean. Nobody knows. I certainly don't know.
Do you think it will survive the euro?
I think so. I think the Germans and the French very much want it, and the Italians adore being part of the Eurozone. So I'm sure it will continue.
So, and so do you think in order for it to continue, though, we need to see further fiscal integration?
Well, yeah, they have to adopt a set of rules that governs fiscal deficits, and they have to get out of, and they have to do something about the horse that's already been stolen from the barn. Sorry about the horse twice, but so that's a mess. But I'm sure that if the politicians work hard enough on it, they'll come up with a solution to the Greek problem.
Professor Phelps, I just want to ask you also just about, you talked about goosing growth and trying to get further growth.
Yeah.
If governments are actually focused on cutting deficits, then how are they able to do that growth? I mean, Christine Lagarde from the IMF was talking about how maybe some governments need to actually be turning on the fiscal pump.
Well, I wasn't thinking of fiscal stimulus when I said goosing up growth. I was thinking of things to increase the dynamism of the economy, more innovation, more business investment activity, not just another stimulus to consumer demand, which I don't think is very efficacious and possibly not even a good idea.
How do you go about stimulating business investment?
Well, I mentioned the Bank for Innovation before. Another thing that badly needs overhaul is corporate governance, that frightening, vague word, but I think but what it boils down to is the CEOs of the business corporations should be required to look a little farther ahead than the next 3 months and hitting the next quarterly earnings target, and that maybe we're going to have to reorganize the corporate boards to get that kind of long-term vision.
You talk about that reorganization of the corporate boards, but also you've also mentioned something about the reorganization of banks and the way that banks deal, or the banks approach their own purchases, for example, of sovereign debt. Now, tell me about that.
Oh my gosh, that's terrible. We have this unholy alliance between governments and banks, under which the governments can borrow at very, very low rates of interest, so they just go to town. And the banks love loading up on government debt because, thanks to regulations in favor of that, they don't have to hold any reserves against such debt. So it's a diabolical agreement here, and that shunts a lot of bank lending away from the private sector, away toward business investment where it ought to go, and into the coffers of the treasuries where it's spent.
So something else that needs to change. Professor Phelps, thank you very much indeed for coming to talk to us here in Lindau on the shores of Lake Constance. Francine, it's back to you in London.